GM recently issued a recall on Chevy, GMC, and Cadillac truck and SUVs that feature the L87 6.2 liter V8 engine. And even if you don't own one of those, it reveals really important information. Hi, I'm Lake, the Motor Oil Geek. Let's break down this recall notice and how it busts an internet motor oil myth. There's some really interesting information here when it comes to motor oil. It's kind of the key of this whole recall. So let's set some backstory. There's been an investigation into rod bearing failures. So this particular recall focuses on the 2021 through 2024 model years. Now what's interesting is it's a voluntary recall, but they're mandating it on unsold inventory. So if there happens to be a 21 to 2024, one of these vehicles with an L87 engine sitting on a dealer lot, they're supposed to do two things. First, there's an inspection process we're going to cover in a minute, and then there's a fix. Now that fix actually involves changing the viscosity of the motor oil. So what's interesting about this recall is it begins with the notification of an inspection procedure. So the service procedure is to check, inspect for DTC P0016. What this is an alignment code between the crankshaft and the camshaft. So the camshaft turns at 50% of crankshaft speed. This is a V8 engine with a single camshaft. That camshaft is in a V above the crankshaft. Because there's variable valve timing in some of these engines, it also measures where the crankshaft is. So the alignment between the camshaft and the crankshaft is being measured in real time by the engine. So what they're doing is using the computer to check for a misalignment between the camshaft and the crankshaft. If there's a lower end problem with one of the bearings in the cranks or the rods, it can create a misalignment between the crankshaft and the camshaft. It can see that deviation. So that is the go, no-go that GM is using for their inspection procedure. If there's a failure in progress, they're saying we can see that misalignment, therefore just replace the engine, essentially. But if there's not a misalignment, if the failure hasn't happened yet, they're taking corrective action by changing the motor oil viscosity. And this is where things get really, really interesting when you're the motor oil geek. So let's go ahead and talk about what they're changing here with the viscosity. So these engines called for 0W20 from the factory. With this recall, they're changing to 0W40. The reason the 0W40 is a fix or a band-aid for this problem can be found in the Strybeck curve. If you remember from our previous video we've done on the Strybeck curve, there are 3 stages of lubrication: boundary, mixed, and hydrodynamic. Main bearings and rod bearings operate in the hydrodynamic regime. In the Strybeck curve, where you are in boundary, mixed, or hydrodynamic is determined by 3 factors: viscosity, speed, and load. In this case, they can't change the speed or the load of the engine. So to increase that bearing film thickness, to protect those bearings in the crankshaft, you're increasing viscosity. Looking at the SAE J300 viscosity grades, you can see that going from a 0W20 to a 0W40 is actually a really big leap in viscosity. We're going from essentially 6.9 to 9.3 centistokes, let's just call it around an average of 8 centistokes, all the way up to the range of 12.5 to 16.3, call it 14 centistokes. So you're going to go from 8 centistokes to 14 centistokes, roughly. Besides that change in what's called the kinematic viscosity, the flow rate of the oil, the key difference between a 0W20 and a 0W40 is the high temperature, high shear, also known as the bearing oil film thickness. The HTHS, high temperature, high shear test, involves rotational speed. It's not just the flow, it's actually providing some shear. trying to simulate really what's happening in the bearing, and it's run at 150 degrees C, 300 degrees Fahrenheit, as opposed to just 100 degrees C, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So going from 2.6 to 3.5 on the bearing film thickness is a big change. Now, why are they doing that? If you don't have enough film thickness, you're going to have a bearing failure. Now, in my past work, we've done testing for King engine bearings and for other coating companies that do bearing coatings. And what's interesting is when we do those tests, like we've shown the test when we got a Chevy Specialty Racing engines, we're running the engine at 3,000 RPM and we're making all these sweeps. When we're running a bearing test, not a camshaft wear test, we're actually taking that same engine with that same setup on the same dyno, but as opposed to running it at 3,000 RPM and running sweeps up to 6,000 RPM, we're actually running the engine down at 1,500 RPM. And sometimes we turn the load even higher and turn the RPM down a little bit lower to 1,200 RPM. That low speed and high load thins out the bearing film thickness. And oh, by the way, we're normally running a 5W30 or higher viscosity when we're doing the endurance high temperature camshaft wear testing. When we do bearing testing, we use a 0W20. It moves you closer to that point where you don't have the hydrodynamic wedge anymore. If you want to wear the bearing, you're going to need to use a thinner oil. While the Strybeck curve totally answers why GM made this change from the 020 to the 0W40, it's increasing bearing film thickness. It's giving their engine a better chance to live because something's gone wrong, right? Obviously, and I'm not going to speculate as to what happened with the cranks or the rods or the bearings. So there's actually no need to speculate because hot off the presses is the NHTSA recall report, which shows there are two contributing factors to this recall issue. Number one is sediment in the connecting rod and crankshaft oil galleries. Basically, that's just sediment and debris in the engine, which like we've shown before. Early oil changes are really important on a brand new engine because the highest amount of wear is during engine break-in. So you don't want extra junk in the engine that can cause issues. So doing this early oil change is actually helpful in terms of getting that junk out of the engine, especially because there's extra junk in the wrong places. Number two is crankshaft specification and surface finish. Rougher surfaces need greater film thickness. So this oil change procedure that GM is doing, not just changing the oil alone, but changing the viscosity of the oil, is actually addressing both of these issues. Get the junk out of the engine by doing an oil change. Number two, increase the viscosity, increase that oil film thickness to help compensate for that rougher surface finish on the crankshaft. With the short block on these engines, by increasing the viscosity of the oil, they're able to use tribology to help solve the problem to prevent the engine from failing. Okay, so that's the takeaway from this recall because that's all they're changing. We can see right here in the recall notice, if they don't detect the misalignment between the camshaft and the crankshaft, what does the recall tell them to do? Just change the oil. Drain out the 020, take off the filter, take off the 020 fill cap, put in 0W40 supercar oil, because that's what they have, put on a 040 fill cap, and then put a new filter on. And the filter they're putting on is the exact same filter that just came off. So they're not changing anything with the filter. And oh, by the way, they need to put an addendum in the owner's manual to now say use 0W40 versus 0W20. Now here's the thing, the 040 and 020 both allow the vehicle to start at -35 degrees Celsius, because that's what a 0W means. And we won't cover all the details. In fact, I'm gonna leave a link in the description box below for 3 of our previous videos that will be really helpful for understanding the context of all of this. Those are our last video about the film strength testers and why they don't tell the truth. And here we make that video and then GM issues this recall that basically backs it up. They're not changing the additive package or anything To fix the bottom end problem, they're changing viscosity. So a proper test for a real engine needs to simulate all 3 stages of lubrication. For details on those 3 stages of lubrication, we have a previous video about that. And then when it comes to viscosity grades and making sense of a 0W20 versus a 0W40, what does that really mean? We have a video on that. What viscosity grade? So all 3 of those will be linked in the description box below. I might even make a little playlist of just those 3, the Motor Oil Geek Essentials, so you can check those out and give you some context. But the key takeaway is this: a 0W40, a 0W20 can safely crank at negative 35 degrees Celsius. But by the time the oil temperature goes from negative 35 degrees Celsius and gets all the way to 100 degrees Celsius, the 0W40 oil is thicker than the 0W20, and it's that increased thickness that's providing better protection for the bearings. Back to the Strybeck curve. Viscosity times speed divided by load. We're increasing the viscosity to increase our film thickness to protect the bearings. That's the key takeaway from this recall. And in that, an internet motor oil myth just got busted. And what is that myth, you're asking? It's that you can't use a viscosity higher than what the OEM recommends. That somehow or another it's going to damage the engine if you're using, say, a 0W40 as opposed to a 0W20. I understand there's a lot of room for confusion here, but I think we need to understand is why are the low viscosity oils being spec'd here in the US anyway? And why I said that was very specific. You can do some Google searching and find out that in other countries where there's not the EPA and there's not a corporate average fuel economy target that needs to be hit, the exact same engine somewhere else in the world, the owner's manual will call for a higher viscosity oil. For example, I actually have a lot of experience with this LT family of engine, the 6.2 liter direct injection V8. I actually was part of a program with General Motors and Oak Ridge to determine how low a viscosity could you go in that engine and still protect the engine. That the 0W12 super special oil we developed, that was for this same family of engine, the 6.2 liter V8 direct injection. That engine initially called for 5W30. Today, like we said, they were calling for 0W20, but I guess really today, now it's 0W40. Just an FYI, all versions of Mobil 1 0W40, and there are 4 different ones, are now lower calcium formulas that are safe for direct injection engines. So they went from 530 down to 020, now up to 0W40 to fix the bearing problem. The reason for that change in going to the 0W20, 016, 012, 08s like in my daughter's car is because of fuel economy. And we saw that with that test we did with GM and Oak Ridge. Putting a 0W12 in that engine that even though it called for a 5W30, we improved the fuel economy in the EPA drive cycle. We saw a bigger gain with the ionic liquid formula version in the city drive cycle that's typically more lower temperature, and that's where you get the bigger advantage of that lower viscosity oil. Because at say 20 degrees Celsius, that 020 is a lot thinner than even the 0W40. That thinner oil is less drag. That's going to be better fuel economy. When you get to the highway drive cycle, that is a hotter oil temperature, there's less of a gain. Now, in this case, with the GM and Oak Ridge study, this was a highly friction modified, really wild oil. So we saw some pretty big gains because of the unique chemistry of that oil. But in general terms, that lower viscosity gives you more of a gain in the city drive cycle, less of a gain on the highway side. But in either case, lower viscosity means better fuel economy, and that's why the OEMs are recommending lower viscosity grade oils. It's not because the engine is going to blow up if you put a thicker viscosity oil in it. Obviously, and GM just proved that with this recall. Besides low viscosity oils, technologies like auto start-stop and displacement on demand are just ways of gaining fuel economy in the EPA drive cycles. Auto start-stop helps during the city drive cycle. Displacement on demand helps gain fuel economy in the highway drive cycle. So these are just ways of gaining fuel economy for the EPA test. And I know people are gonna cry foul at this video and me saying that, because I've seen the comments. Back to my daughter's car, when I put 016 in a car that called for 0W8, in the comments people were saying, you gotta go back to the 0W8 on the next oil change. Like, oh my God, the engine's gonna blow up if I don't put the thinner oil back in it. What you don't understand is that all oils change viscosity with temperature. We just showed you that. The colder the oil, the thicker it is. No one drives their car only at 100 degrees Celsius oil temperature. All of these engines are always operating with a wide range of viscosity. Winter, your engine oil is thicker because it's colder than in the summer. People in Alaska and Canada have thicker oil in their car than people in Texas or Florida do, with the exact same oil in the exact same car because of the environment you're in. All oils change viscosity with temperature. What GM is doing by calling for a 0W40 as opposed to a 0W20 is just increasing bearing oil film thickness when the engine is under high load, high temperatures. It's just protecting it from the worst case scenario. That's it. You can put a higher viscosity oil than what's called for in the owner's manual here in the US without damaging your engine. But before everyone runs out and changes their viscosity oil because I said so, know that just because you increase the viscosity of the oil doesn't mean you're getting better engine protection. That's right. Here at Speed Diagnostics, we see hundreds of oil samples each week, and we've seen where people decide to go from a 020 to a 530 or a 040 in their engine to get better protection because they don't trust that thinner oil. But not every time does that increase in viscosity equate to lower wear metals in the used oil samples. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So I would encourage you, if you want to change your viscosity, take a sample with the current viscosity, get a baseline, then change the viscosity, go up a viscosity grade, and then measure again and see, did it help? Because if you go to that higher viscosity oil, you are going to lower your fuel economy, and you might make the engine run hotter. Thicker oils typically make the engines run hotter. We've seen that in the dyno tons of time. So in this case, GM is using tribology to solve the problem by increasing bearing film thickness to counteract a problem they have with the bottom end. They're using it as a band-aid. That doesn't mean that you should go out and put a thicker viscosity oil in your engine blindly. If the data says it's better for your engine, then do it. But don't do it without data, right? That's the motto of this channel. Science, not speculation. You don't have to guess. You can do used oil analysis and have data and make a good data-driven decision. If you happen to have one of these L87 engines under the recall, probably a pretty good idea. Go ahead and put some 0W40 in there, protect yourself. If you don't, and you're curious about a higher viscosity oil and what it can do for you, take those samples before and after and see what the science says and follow the data. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.